As part of the Student Fellows program at Perry Worldhouse, over the past year, we've been working on a research project to promote international religious freedom in United States foreign policy. The Student Fellows research team on this project included Julia Ciocca, Annie Su, Arnav Jagasia, Jonathan Lahdo, Jimena Nestares, and Karina Shah. The research project and today's presentation can be broken up into three main parts. In Section 1, we'll discuss religious freedom and foreign policy and the challenges of promoting religious freedom in United States foreign policy, as well as the steps the United States government has taken so far to this end. In the second section of the presentation, we'll outline a policy framework for promoting international religious freedom, and then in the third section of the presentation, we will apply this policy framework to 5 illustrative examples of where advancing religious freedom can go hand in hand with other policy objectives of United States foreign policy.
In order to explain some of the challenges associated with addressing religious freedom from a foreign policy standpoint, we'll start by providing some context to the issue. Firstly, as we are all aware, religious freedom is a fundamental human right, as recognized by Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. For the United States foreign policy context, we'd also like to clarify that promoting religious freedoms aligns with several goals of US foreign policy, with examples ranging from human rights violations and migration and asylum to freedom of expression and representation in government. It's also important to note that thinking about the issue of religious freedom abroad is not something new for United States foreign policy, as the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act made religious freedom a foreign policy priority for the United States, as it created the Office of International Religious Freedom and associated offices and positions that advised the country on how best to promote international religious freedom abroad, and also published things like reports on measuring international religious freedom across different countries.
So, as mentioned before, promoting religious freedom is well aligned with certain aspects of the U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. does have a record with working with faith-based organizations around the world, and can certainly see an advantage of promoting religious freedom in foreign policy. However, there is no classical foreign policy solution for religious-based issues. This is because there's two sides to a coin. The promotion of human rights to religious freedoms might incidentally create an environment that breeds religious-based violence and extremism, and that might interfere with women's rights as well. The U.S. should develop strategies and solutions to promote religious freedoms, but it should also establish strategies in order to mitigate religious-based violence and develop legal protections for women. Another challenge in promoting international religious freedoms is the fact that in most countries, there's at least some religious diversity, and thus promoting the necessary complementary legal infrastructure changes is difficult in the context of a theocratic government or a country with an official state religion. Theocratic regimes often do not accord appropriately with the representation of minority groups, if any at all. The U.S. should further religious freedoms in order to address other foreign policy priorities. A whole government approach would be appropriate in order to tackle complex religious-based issues.
To develop a policy framework, we first need to recognize the influence that religion has in a variety of other issues and their connections. For instance, in our first paper, we identify 5 key issues of foreign policy that are closely connected with religion that we will talk more about later on. Because of the interconnections between these issues, we're proposing a whole-of-government approach for the promotion of religious freedom, which would consist of engaging a variety of stakeholders to collaborate and contribute to these efforts. And it requires coordination both at the international level and our domestic front. First, we will use the 3-pronged traditional elements of foreign policy to promote religious freedom: preparedness, awareness, and enforcement. Preparedness entails training and preparing our diplomatic missions for initiatives to engage with faith-based organizations abroad, information sharing about religious violence and extremism. Awareness will consist of increasing awareness of oppressive religious regimes and human rights violations, as well as research into these oppressive regimes. Enforcement involves coordinating diplomatic, economic, security strategies across the government, and some examples would include sanctions, bilateral negotiations on policy coordination, and export controls. In each of our 5 key issue areas, we will elaborate on the specific policy recommendations that are based on these 3 traditional foreign policy elements. Beyond these 3 traditional elements of foreign policy, we propose for the government to engage international organizations and the private sector in our strategy. On the international level, we add 2 priority focus areas to our strategy, which are legal reform and norm setting. Our foreign policy should focus on the legal framework and institutions surrounding the protection of religious freedom and human rights, as opposed to directly targeting religious doctrines. This not only helps with creating a more effective and culturally sensitive foreign policy, but also helps with striking this difficult balance between ensuring freedom of religious expression and defending against potential human rights violations that are committed under the guise of religious precepts. We're achieving this balance by specifically targeting state legal systems and institutions while avoiding exclusive targeting of religious practices and customs. This means that in our framework, we're advocating for legal system reforms for offering greater and more effective human rights protections. We're also advocating for collaboration with transnational civil society networks and grassroots legal aid organizations to promote community legal rights education in order to increase potential litigants' awareness of their rights and to encourage litigants to file their claims. In order to empower groups and individuals who are targeted by oppression that are justified with religious reasons to remove themselves from those situations through legal means without imposing constraints on benign religious expressions. This translates into our norm-setting strategy in multilateral forums. To shift from a strategy of cultural resistance, one that focuses exclusively on penalizing cultural norms, to a strategy of legal reform that focuses on building more equitable legal systems. Now I will hand over to Julia to discuss engaging the private sector in our strategy, as well as ensuring consistency of our domestic policy with foreign policy.
As a part of our proposed framework, we believe that any dialogue on religious freedom should include the private sector and its industry leaders. Here we have 3 examples of what that private sector would actually include: companies building emerging technologies, import-export businesses, and the defense industry. We consider this public-private partnership to be an important inclusion in our policy framework because the technology, resources, and/or infrastructure of these industries can be used both to support religious freedoms and occasionally, unintentionally, persecute belief systems. For example, the use of facial recognition software has been used to target and persecute members of specific religions abroad. By working with the private sector from the start, policies seeking to support religious freedoms and the freedoms of all belief systems will be better equipped to prevent either the malicious use of the products being made or utilize the beneficial characteristics and resources of these industries to further the protection of religious freedoms. In addition to this, we also believe that U.S. foreign policy on religious freedom must also be consistent with U.S. domestic policy. We recognize that religious freedom is a highly complex and complicated issue, and one that requires a great deal of cultural sensitivity. We also recognize that it is a problem that happens globally, including within the United States. Therefore, while we continue to support the pursuit of an American foreign policy that would seek to promote and protect religious freedoms and the freedoms of all belief systems, we also believe that as a part of this process, we should address the different areas within America's own domestic policy and legislation that could be improved to better protect religious freedoms. Listed here are some examples, such as our asylum and non-refoulement policy, our policies governing child marriage and others women's rights issues, our policy governing emerging technologies such as facial recognition software, and our educational efforts to increase awareness, tolerance, and understanding regarding cultural diversity. From here, we can move into our proposed policy framework. This framework will seek to promote religious freedoms and the freedoms of all belief systems through 3 key areas: international advocacy, public-private dialogue, and domestic policy agendas. These areas will be supported by policies that focus on enforcement, preparedness, and awareness. In the following sections, we will outline how we believe the policy framework can work and help structure policy recommendations by applying it to 5 illustrative examples of potential policy areas that intersect with religious freedoms.
Thank you, Julia. Now, in this section of the presentation, we're going to take a look at the policy framework that we just outlined and apply it through the lens of 5 different key foreign policy issues that we've identified, the first of which being blasphemy laws. Blasphemy laws often serve to repress freedom of speech and persecute religious minorities on the basis of vague legislation. Essentially, what that means is these laws don't typically define in great detail what exactly constitutes a blasphemous statement. Yet, despite this, the penalties can range from something like fines to more drastic measures, such as imprisonment or even death. The latter is something that we saw in the case of Asia Bibi from Pakistan. Pakistan is a country with an official state religion, which is Islam, and in this case, we see Asia Bibi, a minority Christian in the country, who was punished under this law following a local dispute that occurred within her village. In this case, it is evident that despite a clear lack of evidence, most of it being hearsay from local residents, she was still persecuted and only freed after significant efforts from the international humanitarian community to free her from this unjust trial that she was facing. It's also important to note that these blasphemy laws don't only occur or exist in countries that maintain an official state religion. Italy, for example, which abolished Roman Catholicism as the official state religion in 1984, has within the Italian Criminal Code a law, Article 724, that says, "Whoever publicly blasphemes with invectives or outrageous words against the divinity is punished with a monetary administrative penalty of 51 to 309 euros. Again, this is a clear example of how there is a lack of clarity in what can be defined as a blaspheme against a divinity and how exactly that might even be applied given a lack of evidence potentially. In this diagram on the right, we can also see the top 7 countries by blasphemy laws that deviate most from international human rights laws principles. So how exactly can we deal with this issue? Essentially, we believe that the US should make combating blasphemy laws a foreign policy priority via international advocacy and direct engagement. Firstly, we believe that the United States should raise concerns to countries that enforce these laws and engage in relevant multilateral discourse at international fora, i.e., directly bringing up the issue of the application of blasphemy laws to countries that implement them. Additionally, we feel that supporting congressional measures like H.R. 512 from 2016 would be invaluable in promoting religious freedom as a core component of US foreign policy. Actively training civil servants at relevant US diplomatic missions on how to deal with incidents of blasphemy is an example of direct engagement that we believe will be effective in combating blasphemy laws, as it would allow these staff at US diplomatic missions to understand how to either promote freedom of speech and religion within those countries, or rather aid those members or citizens of those countries that have been affected by blasphemy laws or are part of NGOs that fight them, for example. And finally, the other direct engagement proposal that we suggest is more deeply integrating combating blasphemy laws as a core DRG principle of US aid. Essentially, what we mean here is that we believe screening projects that could be linked to either those that support blasphemy laws or their implementation, or have any links to relevant officials, should be screened out when it comes to providing grants from USAID and general development funding.
The next issue we will be discussing is women's rights in education. Women's rights and the advocacy for better protections and educational opportunities for women has a highly complicated relationship with religion, because religion has frequently been used as a justification to limit or violate women's rights and access to education. These violations include forced and child marriage, which disproportionately impact women and girls, sexually based and gender-based violence, limited access to healthcare or health education, especially regarding sexual and reproductive health, and limited access to schools or other educational opportunities. However, although religion has certainly been used as a justification for creating detrimental and at times violent practices regarding women, the promotion of religious freedoms may actually be beneficial to women's rights. For example, as these graphs show, countries with higher governmental and social restrictions on religious freedoms tend to have higher gender inequality as well. This suggests that by promoting religious freedom on the basis of free choice to practice or not practice any particular belief, women's rights and equalities may actually be improved. Thus, the United States should find ways to encourage legal reforms that better protect women's rights, enabling a stronger balance between their rights and religious freedom. A few examples on how to do this include advocating for increased legal protections for women's rights by attaching them to international agreements and deals, and raising the awareness both domestically and internationally for the need to improve women's rights, as well as the importance of free will and the choice to practice any belief system or to abstain from any belief system. Additionally, the United States needs to address issues to offer better protections for women's rights in the U.S. In doing so, the U.S. should address and improve its laws regarding child and underage marriage, forced marriages, and sexually based and gender-based violence. Finally, America's foreign policy should utilize sanctions, treaties, and international norms in order to establish a means through which the United States can actively improve women's rights.
This year, the U.S. has lowered the cap on the maximum numbers of refugees they receive. This increases the number of asylum and refugee claimants who seek protection from religious persecution, and they're being returned to persecution or other more dangerous situations. Religious persecution is one of the 5 established grounds for establishing eligibility for asylum or refugee status. This is outlined in the 1951 Convention related to the status of refugees and U.S. immigration law.
Our overarching policy recommendation for migration issues related to religious freedom would be for the U.S. to account for considerations of religious freedom in its foreign and immigration policy for refugee and asylum seekers. On the international level specifically, our strategy consists of enforcement and international advocacy in order to minimize religious persecution internationally. In doing so, we try to mitigate the root causes of displacement due to religious persecution. First, the Department of Treasury should impose targeted sanctions on senior members of governments that are directly or indirectly involved in enabling policies and practices of religious persecution, which means freezing their personal foreign financial assets in the U.S. and prohibiting their entry into the country. Second, the State Department should engage with like-minded liberal democratic allies in imposing these sanctions and establish a coordinated campaign to raise awareness of these governments' human rights violations in multilateral fora such as the UN Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Committee for the ICCPR, and the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In the Human Rights Council specifically, the State Department should work specifically with allies to prevent the election of perpetrator states to the Council's membership. Third, the State Department and the Department of Justice should submit cases of state-sponsored religious persecution to the International Court of Justice, although we recognize that the scope of the ICJ's jurisdiction is limited to states that have voluntarily submitted to its compulsory jurisdiction. For our domestic policy recommendation, Jimena will first talk about treatment of asylum seekers in detention facilities.
The Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, should adhere to Sections 5.5 of the detention standards, which details the standards that detention centers should provide for religious practices. They should also require private sector detention centers to adhere to such detention standards. We should also ensure that faith-based refugees and asylum rights advocacy organizations and other human rights organizations have access to immigration detention facilities to provide faith-based support and social services.
In addition to the treatment of asylum seekers in detention facilities that Jimena just talked about, we're also proposing for domestic policies for broader immigration system reforms, especially the refugee and asylum application processing system, and focusing on eradicating the backlog of asylum cases that the U.S. currently has, and also ensuring that the U.S. adhere to its legal human rights obligations. We recognize the prolonged partisanship on this issue in Congress and the complexity involved with proposing immigration reforms. Thus, we're focusing on 3 specific elements that would improve the U.S. asylum adjudication system and procedures to be more aligned with the U.S.'s international law obligation. First, the Department of Justice, especially the Attorney General, should minimize interventions in immigration courts to ensure the independence of these courts' operations for judges to reach independent decisions on asylum cases. Second, the Department of Homeland Security and immigration officers should ensure that all asylum and refugee claimants who seek protection from religious persecution are not subject to expedited removal proceedings and are guaranteed access to a fair hearing of their cases, including adequate time to seek legal representation, to gather documentation and to prepare their cases, as well as guaranteeing individualized assessment of their claims and situations before any immigration enforcement actions are taken. Third, Congress should repeal the one-year statutory bar provision in the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. This policy provision has required all asylum applicants to apply for asylum and for withholding of removal within 1 year of their arrival in the U.S., without taking into account challenges for doing so, such as financial needs, lack of access to legal representation, social networks, and difficulty in gathering documentations, etc. Repealing this policy provision would help uphold the U.S.'s legal obligations to provide fair, individualized assessment of each asylum case by guaranteeing adequate time for asylum seekers to prepare their cases.
The fourth case study we want to highlight is the abuse of dual-use technology. We find that this is an objective of the United States' trade and technology policy that goes hand in hand with advancing religious freedoms abroad. Suppressive regimes have abused emerging dual-use technology to persecute and surveil religious groups, especially religious minorities. Over the past year, we've learned that the Chinese government has deployed facial recognition and biometric data collection technology throughout the Xinjiang region of China, home to a large minority Muslim population. Additionally, in Russia, we've learned that the government has installed security cameras and surveillance devices in houses of worship in regions with large ethnic minority populations. Furthermore, the Office of the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vices acts as the main religious enforcement agency of Saudi Arabia, and they started using data mining and big data analytics over the nation's entire social media data to get a better sense of the traffic and the content of users on these platforms, and they scan all of the data to look for any sort of religious violations in the same sense that Jonathan discussed earlier when talking about blasphemy laws. In order to address this, the United States should restrict foreign governments from using dual-use technology, especially technology produced in the United States itself, to oppress religious freedom both here or abroad. There are several policy options the U.S. government can adopt to meet this end, but we've outlined a few below. First, the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom should publish a list of governments that abuse technology for religious oppression to guide policymakers' understanding of this issue. In addition, they can designate all countries that abuse technology for religious oppression as countries of particular concern under the IRFA. In addition, the Department of Commerce can restrict exports of emerging technologies to countries known to surveil religious groups. And lastly, to increase dialogue with the private sectors and those who actually manufacture this dual-use technology. The United States Department of State should invite leaders in emerging technology industries to the annual ministerial to advance religious freedom. Next, I'll hand it over to Jimena to discuss how advancing religious freedom can go hand in hand with the United States' policy of combating religious extremism.
Religious-based extremism is a credible threat to American national security. An example of this is Islamist radical groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Boko Haram, and growing extremist groups in Europe such as the Confederation, Liberty and Independence Party in Poland, which has been able to secure a seat in the Polish parliament. In order to limit the ability of extremist groups to mobilize, we need the Department of Treasury to place targeted sanctions on senior members of these extremist groups. The purpose of these sanctions would be to limit access to funds in order to limit mobility of these groups. I also think that the Department of State should work with the European allies to require social media platforms to remove hate-filled religious content from social media. In order to assist individuals vulnerable to extremist groups, the Department of Treasury should consider providing foreign aid to European administrations under the threat of an extremist regime change. Also, the Department of Defense and National Security apparatus should engage with allies to discuss the best security practices to monitor vulnerable regions. For example, using military diplomacy, preparedness, information sharing, and education.
The first part of our presentation leads to two main takeaways. First, the United States can promote religious freedom in order to address and advance other key foreign policy priorities. And second, the United States can use a whole-of-government approach to tackle the more challenging religious-based issues. To do so, we developed a policy framework that includes awareness, preparedness, and enforcement, as well as international advocacy, public-private dialogue, and a domestic policy agenda. For this project, we also wrote 2 policy papers. The first paper outlines the problem in more detail and goes into each of those 5 illustrative case studies to outline how they relate to a policy of advancing international religious freedom. The second policy paper details policy agendas for each of these case study areas and develops our framework for any other area of U.S. foreign policy where advancing international religious freedom could go hand in hand. Thank you so much for watching our presentation, and we hope you get a chance to also read our policy papers.